Sexual abuse is undoubtedly one of the preeminent moral issues of our era, even in an age when we face very, very many serious challenges. Over the last decade, people in many countries have, in fits and starts, begun to come to grips with the scale and the consequences of sexual abuse. Sometimes we know it directly and personally through the experience of loved ones, but only in the last decade has it become clearer, or at least more publicized, how systemic and widespread sexual abuse is. I remember quite vividly the way my own world was turned upside down in a sickening way the day the Boston Globe first published the Spotlight investigation on sexual abuse in the Catholic Church in 2002. Perhaps for some of the younger people here, or students, you first experienced some of the same shock when you heard about the Philadelphia grand jury report, Pennsylvania grand jury report. Some of you may know it from different institutions you're connected to. And similarly, it's an issue we've had to grapple with here at the college. Few places more than Ireland have been as convulsed by the revelation of systemic sexual abuse. Ireland is the home of today's speaker. Revelations about abuse related to Ireland's Magdalene laundries, the church and state-sponsored homes for unmarried pregnant women, related to clerical sexual abuse, related to other forms of abuse facilitated through institutions, related to abuse in familial settings, has really rocked and changed Ireland. I suspect and I hope that most of us have given thought, considerable thought even, to how to end the cycle of abuse that we're now aware of and how to help victims. But few of us are probably terribly adept at that. Our speaker today, though, is someone who's done a great deal of thought about this issue and has done it extremely well. She's a leader in shaping an ethical, holistic response to the needs of those who have been sexually abused as children. When my friend Professor Paige Reynolds first told me about the work that Maeve Lewis does, I was immediately drawn to learn more about it because it was clear from what Paige said that Maeve's work puts survivors first, front and center of her concern, and because she's been successful at helping survivors of child sexual abuse and their families move forward. So I'm grateful to Paige for paving the way to bring her here. Maeve Lewis is Executive Director of 1 in 4 Ireland, an organization that provides professional support to men and women who've experienced childhood sexual abuse. The name 1 in 4 is a reference to research that 1 in 4 children in Ireland experiences sexual abuse by age 18. The organization was founded in 2003 to be a public voice for victims of clergy and institutional sex abuse. Since then, its focus has expanded. Nearly half its clients today were sexually abused in contexts that we've only lastly begun to come to grips with. They were abused by family members. Maeve will tell us about the attachment-based approach of psychotherapy that has also helped 1 in 4 clients and their families. 1 in 4 also focuses on prevention and offers an innovative intervention program for sex offenders. Its advocacy arm actively influences policy and legislation that impacts its clients. In addition to her work with 1 in 4, Maeve has worked overseas as a psychotherapist specializing in sexual trauma. She's worked in post-conflict situations in the former Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, and in Sierra Leone, training local trauma counselors. She's a registered expert witness in sexual trauma at the International Criminal Court at The Hague and has provided training in sexual trauma to legal professionals at the court. I'll also note, because we've talked about it a little bit, and she'll say so too, that obviously the talk about sexual trauma brings up, will certainly trigger some emotions in some people, and we wanted to make sure Professor Reynolds has some materials available for students about who to contact and talk about in cases like that. And she also asked to mention that she leaves those in her door, so if you don't want to walk up and get them from her now, if you want to, anytime you want to do that, they'll be in front of her door.
Yes, so we'll have them here, and then I put them in the box in my front of my door for the 228, so if you want to get them in privacy, you're welcome to do that. They'll be readily available 24/7 on my box bin with 228, or you can contact, obviously, me directly.
Thanks. So I'm grateful that Maeve's agreed to come all the way from Ireland just for us to talk about breaking the cycle of child sexual abuse. Please join me in welcoming Maeve Lewis.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you for inviting me. It's very exciting for me to be here in Holy Cross College today. It's also quite emotional because When I was a very young child, my grandmother, who was then about 50 and a widow, decided she wanted some adventure in her life. And what did she do but come to Worcester to work as a housekeeper to a priest here? And all our childhood was full of stories about Father Harity and Father Connell here in a parish in Worcester. So I actually felt quite emotional today walking around thinking, wow, Granny was here, probably 70 years ago. Sadly, my Granny died about 10 years ago, but all my sisters couldn't believe that I was actually coming to Worcester where Granny had once reigned. So that's quite emotional. My talk today is really going to focus on child sexual abuse and the very systemic approach we take. But really at its core, child sexual abuse is about the abuse of power and abuse of authority. So it is relevant to any form of sexual violence, be it harassment by an employer of a junior employee, a husband terrorising his wife, or indeed an individual, a man or woman, who decides to sexually abuse a child. And as Tom said, I'm always conscious of the impact of talking about sexual abuse because it can trigger all sorts of things for people. So as Tom and Paige have said, there is material and support available for anybody here in the college. At 1 in 4, we believe the world would be a much better place if children were safe from sexual harm. And we work very, very hard to end the trauma of child sexual abuse, be it with the individuals who come to us for psychotherapy, be it their families, or through breaking the cycle by working with the sex offenders. And I'm going to talk to you about that. We work with about 850 clients every year across 4 programs. And I'll give you some details about the type of work we do in a moment. But why 1 in 4? And Tom has sort of stolen my thunder because actually there is research in Ireland that shows that 1 in 4 Irish children experience sexual harm before the age of 18. And if I were to ask everybody in the room here, would you, if you know somebody who's been sexually abused, would you put up your hand? So almost everybody in the room, which is quite amazing. I still find those statistics utterly astonishing. It is very, very hard to believe that if you walk into a classroom in a primary school with 20 kids, 5 of them may be at risk of sexual harm. Or if you go into a huge multinational company with thousands of employees, maybe 1,000 of those people experience sexual harm in childhood and are still carrying those scars. And it's not just in Ireland, because there has been a meta-analysis done of all the different research across the world. And while it's very difficult to compare research because the different questions were asked, different definitions of child abuse, it does show consistently. For example, in the United States, again, about 1 in 4. In Scandinavia, about 28%. Very surprisingly, in Australia, 38%. And on it goes. Children who are being sexually abused are very, very unlikely to tell, because the person who's abusing them is likely to be a person who is an authority, be it within their family, in their community, or in some institution they're involved with, be it the Catholic Church, or, for example, at the moment we have a huge scandal going on in Ireland relating to Scouting Ireland. I think you have a similar organisation here in the States where children go on campsites and so on. And what we do know, and as you probably know, if you know somebody who's been sexually abused, it has a huge impact right across the person's lifespan. The hurt does not stop when the abuse stops, but continues to contaminate a person's life. I'm always, I suppose, concerned when speaking about the impact of sexual abuse, not to create a stereotype, because there isn't one. Children respond in different ways to sexual abuse, and the things that happen along the course of their life will have a huge impact. What we know about sexual abuse really has come from the people who reach out for help, who come to an organisation like 1 in 4 for professional help. We don't know about all the people who were sexually abused who found other ways of healing the damage. For example, I've certainly met people who never, ever attended a psychotherapy session who have built a very good life, perhaps because they met a really positive relationship or made a really positive relationship with their wife or their husband, or perhaps because there was somebody like a teacher when they were in school who understood what was happening and was able to help them see it was not their fault, not their responsibility, or that their family responded well. So when I talk about the impact of sexual abuse and what it is, we have, this is, I suppose, in general what happens, but it can be very different for everybody. And when we think about sexual abuse, we sort of recoil from the thought of an adult having a sexual relationship with a child, raping a child, forcing a child to have oral sex, touching a child inappropriately, making a child feel humiliated and uncomfortable, making a child feel that there is something wrong with them. But ultimately, child sexual abuse is about a breach of attachment. It happens in a relationship, and it is about the breach both in the relationship between the person who's abusing the child, particularly if that person is a family member, but also the breach in relationship with all the other adults who should have noticed something was wrong and either wouldn't or couldn't see what was happening. One of the great American psychologists says, whenever a child is being sexually abused, somebody's eyes are closed. Somebody should have noticed, somebody should have been able to step in. But the real damage of child sexual abuse is that it absolutely creates a sense of dehumanization in the child. At the time of the abuse, the child as a unique human individual ceases to exist. In the eyes of the abuser, they're merely an object there for that person's gratification of whatever their needs are. The child often experiences terror, and for a small child being sexually abused, if there is, for example, oral sex, they may feel that they're being smothered, that they're going to die, or that they're going to be ripped open, and that they can't do anything to stop that. There is the utter sense of powerlessness, and I mean, we've all experienced powerlessness in childhood in various different ways, when we've had to do things we didn't want to do, or were forbidden to do things we wanted to do. But ultimately, in sexual abuse, that powerlessness is at the core of what happens afterwards. And of course, there is the secrecy and the silencing. Typically, sex offenders, sexual abuse of a child rarely happens with witnesses. So typically it happens utterly in secrecy. And typically, the offender find ways to silence the child. They make the child feel that there's something wrong with them, and that if they tell about this, everybody will know that they're a dirty little person. They tell the child that if they tell, for example, one client recently said her father used to say, if you tell, I'll go to prison and then you'll all be homeless. If you tell, something terrible will happen to you. So they coerce the child into that secrecy and silence. And of course, with sexual abuse, maybe not of young children, it's unlike any other crime. I mean, if my house is burgled or if I'm mugged on the street, nobody's going to blame me or say I was doing something wrong. Whereas with sexual abuse, particularly when teenagers are involved, very often society places a huge attribution of blame on the victim, that it was something the victim did that caused the offence, rather than placing the blame squarely and responsibly with the sex offender. I'd like to quote the wonderful American Harvard psychologist. I had the privilege recently at a trauma conference of seeing her speak, Judith Lewis Herman, who unfortunately is no relation of mine. But she says that when we talk about sexual abuse, that remembering and telling the truth about terrible events are prerequisites for the restoration of the social order and the healing of individual victims. The conflict between the will to deny terrible events, and the will to proclaim them is the central dialectic of psychological trauma. So I think what Judith Lewis Herman is trying to tell us, that child sexual abuse leaves an absolute trail of destruction, first of all on the life of the child who's been sexually abused and right through their lifespan, but also on their family, on their community, and on the society in which they live. We've seen very much in Ireland that seesaw event happening at a societal level. If we take the Catholic Church scandal, which really tore apart Irish society in the first decade of this century, as you know, statutory inquiry after statutory inquiry showed not alone the priests were sexually abusing children, but that there was massive cover-ups at the level of the hierarchy. So we have really seen how in the aftermath of those reports, people were really aware of what had happened. Oddly enough, people were obviously very angry at the individual priests, but there was a certain understanding that in any institution you may find sex offenders. But people were absolutely outraged at the actions of the hierarchy, the bishops, the cardinals, who covered up the abuse, who moved priests from parish to parish in the same familiar way as reports here have done. So for a number of years, there was huge interest in the whole sexual abuse, clerical sexual abuse issue. More recently, just 2 weeks ago, the Pope was having his summit on child protection in Rome. There was almost no coverage in Ireland about that, whereas 10 years ago it would have been the top of every news cycle. It's almost like there was a fatigue. So the society has flipped back into almost a level of denial. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Irish Catholic Church and the very, very positive steps the Church has taken in the intervening years. For individuals, the denial is often about trying to pretend this didn't happen, trying to pretend this didn't have an impact on me, trying to pretend my family is not like that. And then, on the other hand, trying to deal with all the very psychologically intrusive events of child sexual abuse, the nightmares, the flashbacks, the panic attacks, the very debilitating effects that can be there that seep into the person's life. So when we look at sexual abuse, while it is really important that we provide services for the individuals who have suffered so terribly, it is very important, I believe, that we see the individuals in a context. Sexual abuse does not happen in a vacuum. There is obviously the personal impact, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. We have to consider the family, especially where sexual abuse happens in the family. And as Tom said, well over 50% of our clients were sexually abused in their own family. And to try to understand what is the dynamic that is happening in that family that allows the abuse to occur. And that if that dynamic is still operating, then clearly other children are also at risk of abuse going down through the generations. So intervention is needed absolutely, and I'll talk about our family programme too in a minute. If we look at the community, on a number of levels, questions have to be asked. I believe communities often tacitly condone sexual abuse. Very often, we have seen it in Ireland and on many kind of high-profile cases, the sex offender is a high-profile member, a high-status member of the community. And that the community, just like the family, will often be more sympathetic towards the offender than to the victim. Just a couple of weeks ago in the United Kingdom, research was published on the conviction rates for men accused of raping women. And it was found that if the offender was, or the alleged offender, was aged about 18 to 25, the conviction rate was much, much lower than if the person was older. And it is hypothesized that the juries would have been more sympathetic to a young man whose life was just beginning and didn't want perhaps to have the label of rapist around their heads for the rest of their lives, and therefore were likely to come to a decision which actually said they disbelieved the victim. We had one awful situation in Ireland just recently where a man was convicted of rape in a rural town down in the west of Ireland. The actual rape was caught on video outside a pub. The young woman was very, very drunk, but he had dragged her out of the pub and raped her on camera. So when it came to court, the jury absolutely found him guilty. But the entire town, as he waited to go off to prison, made a queue to shake his hand. It was just unbelievable to see something like that happening. But I think it reflects the very ambiguous views we can have in any community about the sex offenders. We have to look at the statutory authorities. Do they really address child protection? For example, in Ireland, it's only in the last 4 years that we have had mandatory reporting of child abuse for professionals such as myself, school teachers, social workers, priests. And do they make the criminal justice system accessible to victims? I mean, we estimated 1 in 4 that fewer than 5%, 1 in 20 men or women who sexually abuse a child will ever face a criminal trial. And we also have to look at the myths that are there in our norms and values, the stereotypes about child sexual abuse and indeed adult rape. So, you know, it's only in very poor dysfunctional families that this happens. That is not true. Or that the young girl, the 14-year-old, was quite seductive and provocative. I mean, you know, could the poor man help himself? We also have to consider, and I'll come back to this because it is such a huge issue, the societal norms now about pornography and images of child sexual abuse. I don't work with adult rape victims anymore, but my colleagues in the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre tell me that the level of violence in adult rapes has gone up exponentially in recent years, partly because young men are downloading images of vicious porn and are, you know, it's being normalised and it's being acted out. And when we look at images of child sexual abuse, they're so freely available. And when I come to talk about our sex offender programme, we have a young offenders programme. Every single one of those young men began their journey to sex offending by downloading images of child abuse at a very young age, at around the age of puberty, 10, 11, 12, becoming sexualised to those images and then going on to act out and abuse younger children. I see that as, and yet, as a society, we have almost normalised that people can access porn. And I would see that as a huge issue. If we move on to consider the impact of child sexual abuse, it is it is complex trauma that we're dealing with. It's not straightforward post-traumatic stress. So let's consider some of the impacts, and I'm just conscious of time, so I'm not going to dwell on this. And as I said, it can be so different for so many people. Sexual abuse in childhood absolutely damages a person's sense of self. At the core, or the core experience, is one of shame. The child will internalize the projection of the sex offender, that they are dirty, filthy, that they are in some way provoking what is happening, that they are contaminated. And that becomes the person comes to represent their sense of self internally as that shameful being. And that will then profoundly affect every other relationship the person has throughout the lifespan. And it is one of the most difficult aspects or impacts to actually address in psychotherapy. The person will generally, in adulthood, be containing overwhelming distress and emotional pain. People will deal with this differently. People will sometimes become terribly cut off from their feelings, very cognitively organised. I work with loads of clients who describe as very heady. It's almost as if their body doesn't exist below the head. And the task of psychotherapy is to begin to acknowledge and integrate those very, very painful feelings that we've talked about. For others, people may have very poor impulse control, be completely unable to contain their emotions. And we see, sadly, many, many survivors who have found a way to self-soothe, who will have developed an addiction to alcohol, very commonly in Ireland, if that's not a stereotype, to other forms of substance, to self-harm, suicide ideation, eating disorders also would be very common. People will also experience changes in consciousness, the nightmares, the flashbacks, the dissociative states, where the original trauma is absolutely intruding on the person's day-to-day living, and again can be very disruptive of a person's lifestyle. People will live, you know, in a traumatic situation. We all know about the fight, flight, or freeze effect. The trouble with unresolved trauma in childhood is that the person remains in that state on a continuous basis, so that they will continue to have high levels of cortisone and adrenal overactivity and so on, even when they're not facing a danger. And that leads to all sorts of somatic problems, psychosomatic illnesses, cardiovascular illnesses, digestive tract illnesses, things like irritable bowel syndrome. All those things will be very common because of the continued overactive system that is going on. There'll also be alterations in memory. Some people will have developed complete amnesia for the traumatic events. Other people will have a part of a narrative, and for other parts of the memory will be sort of implicit traces of memory. The memory may be held in the body, it may be activated by a particular smell or a particular sound, so it's quite a somatic memory as opposed to the ordinary narrative memory of that we all have, that, you know, I got up in the morning, I went to school, I did X, Y, and a Z. The person will generally have difficulties in relationship. Trust is going to be an enormous issue because we go back to the initial breach of attachment. People will often expect relationships to go wrong, and will have huge difficulties with intimacy and often with sexuality as well. And finally, in terms of a person's meaning system, very often somebody who's been sexually abused in childhood will have a very malevolent worldview. They will expect the worst from the world. I mean, most of us live in a world, hopefully, where we believe that the world is a decent place, where we have some control over how our lives and events are going to unfold. But for somebody who's been sexually abused in childhood, that belief has often been turned upside down. I'll always remember working with a client who was sexually abused when she was about 15, and she described the experience afterwards as, it was a once-off but quite vicious assault. She described the experience afterwards as, I felt like a curtain was pulled back and I looked through to a completely different, dark world. And then when the assault ended, I was able to pull the curtain back, and with help, I'm able to get on with my life. But I can never forget what's on the other side of that curtain. The other thing, though, we should remember is that most survivors of child sexual abuse are incredibly resilient. We talk about survivors of child sexual abuse, and many survivors hate to be called victims. They also hate to be called survivors. We've never been able to find another word that would encapsulate somebody who's made a really good recovery from that experience. But most people go on to live ordinary lives. Very often people will overcompensate, for example, academically and professionally. People will get married, they will have children, but very often will struggle within those relationships. But people do get on with life. And the worst, I suppose, insult we can put on adult survivors is to pity them, to see them as victims, to see them as incompetent in their adult world. Part of the role of psychotherapy is to help people make perhaps different choices, but we mustn't forget that resilience is at the core of that experience. Sadly, of course, there are also lots of people who don't make it, and some of the saddest things about 1 in 4 is that we always have a really long waiting list. And in the past 5 years, we know of 4 people who have taken their own lives on the waiting list before we were ever actually able to meet them. And I'll always wonder, if we had managed to see them sooner, would that person still be with us? So maybe just to say a little bit about being a psychotherapist and what's required working in the field of sexual violence. I mean, I think our therapists have to be very highly skilled. They need a lot of training and expertise. They need not to be afraid of the very deep emotional pain that they're going to have to deal with. And that's why in good psychotherapy training, we're all expected to go into psychotherapy ourselves and deal with our own baggage of whatever we're carrying with us. Some of our psychotherapists, I've no doubt, have been sexually abused. That's probably what attracted them to the work, and that's not a problem so long as they've actually dealt with their own issues in relation to that. Another thing a good psychotherapist has to be able to do is to recognize how the original pattern of trauma, the original attachment breach, is going to be acted out in the therapeutic space. And I'll say maybe a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So the therapist also needs a high level of self-awareness, but also needs to be very resilient, because there is always a danger of vicarious traumatization. And all our therapists need huge amounts of clinical supervision and access to therapy themselves occasionally if it all becomes very overwhelming. It is all about relationship. So in a way, this little cartoon doesn't reflect sitting eye to eye with somebody in a therapy room and really forming a deep healing relationship with them without fear. Another American psychologist, we've learned so much from your American experts in this field, says that trauma is really hard to speak, but it's even harder to hear. And she did some research that showed that about 80% of people who've been sexually abused, when they go into therapy, never tell their therapist the full story because they believe the therapist will not be able to hear it, is not strong enough to take on board what it is they're trying to tell. So that poses a huge challenge for the psychotherapist. So I'm just going to tell you very quickly about 2 clients I'm currently working with, just to give you a flavour of the sort of issues that come up and the sort of challenges that are there for me as a psychotherapist. So I'd like you to meet Paul. Paul is 42. He's a very clever man. He has a master's degree in philosophy, and he's sporadically working on a PhD, which seems to will go on forever, I would think. He's a very patchy work relationship. He keeps dropping out of jobs and so on. So he's an underachiever. He's a very lonely man, and that he's had a history of very intense short relationships with women, but the women all in the end the relationship, and he can never understand why. He is one of the angriest men I've ever met. He was sexually abused by his father from the time he was about 4 until he was 9, when his father became incapacitated. His anger emerges in all sorts of ways. I've been working with Paul for 2 years. He has never been on time for an appointment. In the beginning, he used to turn up 40 minutes late. Now we're down to about 15. He is always arguing over fees. He either comes that he doesn't have the money or he doesn't quite have the money, and we work a sliding scale, so it's all based on a person's income. He's constantly questioning my competence as a therapist. Do I know what I'm doing? He's constantly threatening to walk out. He has been very, very rude to our reception staff on occasion, which means I have to address that in our meetings, which creates more anger. Now, behind all that, I can see that Paul's anger masks a very deep vulnerability and an absolute terror. It's like while he stays angry, he doesn't have to be afraid. But at the same time, even though I'm a psychotherapist, I'm a human being, and it does, at times, he intensely frustrates me. He makes me feel de-skilled, that I'm never doing enough. He makes me feel at times that I wish he wouldn't turn up for an appointment at all, that, it's just too much. I sometimes look at my diary and think, oh, God. At the same time, I really like the guy. But what I can see is the way Paul is relating to me and engaging with me in that therapeutic space is exactly what he does out in the world, and is exactly what puts off all his girlfriends. His neediness, his anger, his terror just makes it impossible to engage in relationship. Now, I have high hopes for Paul, if he will stick it out with me, that he will be able to perhaps find a different way of being in the world. And I would love to see him meet some nice woman and settle down happily. Anne is different. Anne is younger. She's only 23, and she was sexually abused by her older brother for years. Anne is very depressed. She's made a couple of suicide attempts. She works in a bank, but she's really at risk of losing her job because there are days when she literally cannot get out of bed. Now, she has a sympathetic boss, but I'm really worried she will lose her job, which will take away, I suppose, one of the scaffoldings on her day that helps keep her alive. She has an eating disorder. She's bulimic. And it can be very difficult to sit with somebody in that level of pain and not get pulled into her hopelessness. I mean, my response to Anne is I really want to wrap her up and take her home and live with me and mind her. But that would be completely unhelpful. I mean, the challenge for Anne, unlike Paul, is that she has to begin to connect to her resilience, to her strength, while she does have to revisit the trauma, while she does have to acknowledge all those really, really painful feelings. It will probably in time emerge as an anger, which will be very positive, and then hopefully that she will be able to move on from this very, very depressed place that she's in. I would be very hopeful for her. So really the work of therapy is to allow the client to revisit the the trauma, and that's an incredibly painful journey. And sometimes people just can't stay that journey and will drop out of therapy. that they really understand the impact the original trauma has had on their current lives, on their way of being in the world, and that they begin to learn that it can be different, and they can be different in the world, and it can move forward. I mean, people will often say, how can you do this work? It must be so depressing, it must be so hard. And sometimes the initial stages of therapy can be very challenging and demanding, but people really do move through. It's not overstating the case to say that people literally can transform their lives and go on to live lives that are satisfying, that are engaged in the world, and where they can form really meaningful, intimate relationships with other people. So that, I think, is what keeps me and people like me in the work that we're doing. I want to talk just a little bit about family. Now, I purposely put up a bomb because when there's a disclosure of sexual abuse in a family, it is literally as if a bomb has gone off, especially if the abuse has taken place in the family. So if the perpetrator is in the family, we have the perpetrator, we have the victim, or maybe victims, and we also have the non-offending adults. So if we use the stereotype, abusive father, non-abusing mother, all the children. There are three sort of typical responses when this happens. The most common response is that the entire family will come together and absolutely ostracize the victim who has spoken out, who has disclosed, who has broken the silence in that family. Less often, the family will split. So very often maybe some siblings will support the victim, or indeed once one person discloses, other siblings will disclose. And much more rarely, people will believe the victim and confront the abuser. In many ways, abusive families are very similar to alcoholic families. You know, there's a very tight boundary on the outside. Mustn't speak about what happens. What happens in this house stays in this house. The needs of one individual are prioritized, the alcoholic, the sex offender. There's no tolerance of expressions of emotion. So, for example, when Paul was a little fellow, he was sharing a bedroom with his brother, and he used to cry every night after the abuse had happened. So one evening at family dinner, the brother said, "Mammy, Paul is crying every night." And the mother says, "Really, Paul? Oh, what's all that about?" With Daddy sitting there. So what could Paul say? It just wasn't allowed to be upset, and it certainly wasn't allowed to talk about what was going on. And I've no doubt whatsoever Paul's mother knew what was happening. So at 1 in 4, we work with the families of both the survivors, but also of the sex offenders. And in many ways, the dynamics are very, 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 very similar. What is, and I really, appreciate the dilemma parents are caught with. So, for example, currently we have parents where their 21-year-old is in our sex offender program and their 18-year-old is in our survivors program. And they're absolutely torn in their loyalties to their son and to their daughter. It is very, very challenging. With good support, though, and we run a family support program that runs alongside the other programs, it is really possible that families change. And we have families saying things like, "How could I have thought that? How could I have believed that?" Some of the most difficult families are the families of the offenders. We have the partners of the offenders who we can see are absolutely colluding with the offenders. We had one woman recently who said in a group that her 8-year-old was a seductive little bitch who had seduced her husband from the day she was born. Now, a year later, that woman was also saying, "My God, how could I have thought that?" Who began to see how they too were groomed, how the dynamic worked. And then they become absolute champions for their children, and that keeps children safe. So we have an advocacy program because when you're dealing with child sexual abuse, it cannot work in isolation. Our survivors and the offenders have to engage with external systems, be it the child protection services or the criminal justice system. Just as I would imagine it is the same in the United States, it is very, very difficult when survivors, and very rarely get to court. We estimate fewer than probably 5% of child sexual abusers are ever prosecuted in the criminal courts. Because it is an adversarial system and there are no witnesses, there's no forensic evidence, so everything hinges on the credibility of the victim in the trial. And the job of a defence lawyer is to tear apart the victim to undermine their behaviour, their personality, things they have done as adults since the abuse. And typically our clients come out of court, whether or not there is a conviction, feeling utterly humiliated and re-traumatised. And that is really challenging indeed. I asked you how many of you know somebody who's been sexually abused. How many of you know somebody who is sexually offended? I'm actually surprised there's quite a few hands going up, because I'm sure, if 1 in 4 children are sexually abused, many of you in the room probably know a sex offender, even though you don't know it yet. We call our sex offender program the Phoenix program, and that was actually one of the offenders in one of the first groups we ran. We were trying to come up with a name with it, who talked about the phoenix, who is able to transform from being burnt in the fire and to grow into this beautiful bird. So holding out the possibility of transformation and redemption for people who commit such terrible crimes. People often ask, big long waiting lists of survivors, why are you using resources to work with these guys? And the answer is, if we are ever going to protect children, we have to provide programs for sex offenders. And many of the offenders who come in our program will never be convicted. So in Ireland, as I think in the States, if you're convicted and go to jail, you might have access to a good treatment program. But if you've never been convicted, but there's been a disclosure in your family, you've nowhere to go. There is nobody who will work with you. So we offer, it's a 2-year program. It is very challenging for the offenders. We have an increasing number of young offenders. So nowadays we have a special group for the 18 to 25-year-olds. And while we can all condemn the actions of a sex offender, when I look at some of those young guys coming in, some of them are in college, some of them are just starting jobs. They all, as I said, started by downloading images of child abuse, which as a society we're not taking any responsibility for. And even if they never go on to abuse another child, and our success rate is very good, it is always going to hang over them. Some of them are going to be convicted. They will be on the sex offender register. It will mean huge things for their employment. We have to bring in their girlfriends and talk to the girlfriends about, as some of those young guys have children, about the dangers to their children, and work with the girlfriends. It is very, very heartbreaking, really, to see how such young lives can have gone so awry when, as a society, as I said, we never took responsibility for the triggers that led them there. And finally, we put a lot of effort into policy, or into policy and influencing. One of the areas we work is public awareness. So everybody in Ireland knows that children might be at risk in the Catholic Church, even though children are probably safer in the Catholic Church in Ireland now than they have ever been. But what people find really impossible to accept is that most children are sexually abused in their own families. The family is still so sacrosanct in Irish society. We've just done a very interesting project called I Am 1 in 4. It's a very different way of researching, where an academic researcher and a photographer worked with a group of our clients, encouraged them to take photos of that would represent their experience, and then write about the photos, because very often people find it very hard to articulate exactly what happened to them. And we're going to have an exhibition in Ireland in May. I've given Tom and Paige copies of that. Unfortunately, it's not up on our website yet, but it will be shortly. And it is very compelling, but quite distressing reading. But I would encourage you all to read it. But our hope there is that more and more people will begin to accept where children really are at risk. And I suppose most of our clients would find it difficult to speak publicly about their experiences. So we see it as our role to speak the truth of their experiences. And I think we've quite an impact on Irish society. We've had a lot of great successes. We were instrumental in getting many of the church inquiries up and running. So the big inquiry, 3 inquiries into diocese, 1 inquiry into the treatment of children in the care of the state in institutions run by Catholic congregations. We have been responsible for massive legislative changes in relation to the criminal justice system, mandatory reporting of children, processes. For example, the Irish police force has been transformed in the years. I've been working about 25 years in this field in terms of how they now work with victims. And that has all come by speaking the voice of survivors. We also do some research, although we've very limited resources. We have a very good piece of research up on our website called Only a Witness, where some of our clients describe their experiences in the criminal justice system. But we work regularly with academics in various Irish universities, where postgrads will take on a project around some aspect of abuse, and they'll work with our clients as their subjects. So we're learning an awful lot through that. So just to finish, sexual abuse does not happen in isolation. While it's important to work with the individuals and to help with the individual distress, if we are ever going to break the cycle, we need to work with all the elements: the client, their families, their communities, the statutory authorities, and the societies in which we live. I mean, when I look at Ireland, it is a transformed society. That is partly because there has been a huge process of secularization, very high levels of investment in education. For example, nowadays about 60% of Irish school leavers end up in third level education. A lot of our young people travel to European countries on Erasmus programs while they're in college. So we're much more educated, and people are much more able to think for themselves. The scandals, the sexual abuse scandals, have had a devastating impact on the Catholic Church in Ireland. When I was growing up, the church was law. The local parish priest was law. I grew up in a rural parish. And people blindly accepted what they were saying, which made us all, in a sense, complicit bystanders in the huge maltreatment of children that was going on both in the institutions and then the sexual abuse by clerics and so on. I'll never forget the day the Ryan report came out, which was the report about the children brought up in institutions. And I went to visit my parents, who live outside Dublin in County Tipperary. And I walked into the kitchen, and the Irish Times that day had a 20-page supplement with extracts from that report. And my mother was reading it, and she was weeping, absolutely weeping. And she was talking about the fact that a lot of the boys, this is a farming community from one of the institutions, used to be brought to work on local farms, and some of them were treated so badly by the local farmers, beaten, half-starved and so on, and that, I mean, my mother is an educated and very articulate woman, but that they felt utterly powerless to intervene. So strong was the community pressure that these were boys who were in the care of the church, but also the difficulty in a small community of challenging neighbours about the treatment of children, which goes right to the underbelly of how sexual abuse can happen. But a lot has changed. If you look at the two referenda in Ireland in the last couple of years, gay marriage, abortion has been introduced into the country. So the church's influence has diminished hugely. But I would finish by saying the church, with the great leadership of Archbishop Diarmuid Martin in Dublin, whom we work very closely with, have put in place a model safeguarding procedure in Ireland. And when I look at the carry-on in the Vatican and the failure to implement real concrete changes, despite all the very welcome words of Pope Francis, if they would only take the Archdiocese of Dublin as a model for what should have happened in child protection across the church and impose it on every diocese across the Catholic world, well, then children would be a lot safer. But there's still a lot of work to do. So I'm not going to say any more. I'd just like to leave it open for questions, if I may.
Good.
Yeah, I don't think as a society we've really taken it on, and I feel very helpless too. I really feel helpless. I mean, when I'm asked about this, say in a radio show or something in Ireland, I say, well, the first port of call is parents. Because in Ireland, anyway, about 80% of 8-year-olds now have a smartphone. Do parents know what their kids are looking at? I mean, you're 2 clicks away from images of child sexual abuse on any device nowadays. I mean, gone are the days of the big computer in the middle of the living room. So parents have a big responsibility. Schools have a huge responsibility too, in terms of educating young people about pornography. There is a big campaign about consent going on in Ireland. Consent as in, when is it okay to have sex with somebody? what is real consent, informed consent. So I think that may be helpful. But it really bothers me that teenagers' notions of healthy sexual relationships is based on absolutely vile, sadistic images of men and women having sex, leaving aside the images of child abuse. Another thing that's emerged in Ireland and across the world is that there are untold apps where you can look at cartoon images of child abuse. And there is a big question in Ireland, is that illegal, actually, because no real child is being abused? So we have so much work to do, and I'm afraid I don't have the answer. Well, Archbishop Dermot Martin was sent back to Ireland in about, 2004, 2005. He had been a Vatican diplomat, had worked out of Ireland most of his life, and my guess is he was sent back and he was told to sort out this problem in the Dublin Archdiocese because the inquiry had started, and shut it down. So he came back, and because he's a very humane man, he began to meet survivors. So he must have met hundreds of our clients in those days. And I've sat in on some of those meetings and watched him cry with survivors, which actually wasn't always helpful, really. But you could see that he was so incredibly moved by their stories. So I think that changed his whole approach. The first thing he did was, in Dublin, unlike many other dioceses, priests who sexually abuse are not defrocked. They're kept out of ministry, but under the control of the diocese. He actually employs, there's a couple of ex-policemen with experience in the field of sexual violence who are there to make sure that these guys are living where they're supposed to live, are in doing whatever job they're supposed to be doing, and are not posing a risk to children. Whereas many other dioceses automatically defrock a priest. I'm actually on the advisory board of it's a self-help group for priests out of ministry, and a lot of those diocesan priests have been defrocked. They're getting no support, financial support. They're living on an old age pension or unemployment benefit or something like that, terrified that they're going to be outed in whatever apartment they're living in, and with no social contact, no support, and therefore are much more likely to reoffend, to go underground and reoffend. The other thing Dermot Martin did, as did many of the Irish bishops, they set up, well, actually, the Irish bishops generally, there is a national board for safeguarding children, which is run by lay experts, and which lays down the policies that must be followed in relation to safeguarding in every parish. So if you walk into any church in Ireland, there'll be a big notice at the back of the church about child safeguarding policy, who to contact if you've concerned. So they've trained lay volunteers to be that contact person, somebody that people would feel comfortable talking to. That's the first thing. Dermot Martin has kept, and he's also set up a safeguarding office. He employs about 10 people in this office to provide advice and support to the guys who are out of ministry, but also who will deal humanely with any survivors. Unlike many dioceses, for example, in Dublin, Dermot Martin has a policy that when somebody takes a civil action against the diocese for harm caused, it will be settled. Maybe not as much as the survivor would want, but a settlement meeting will happen rather than drag somebody through the high courts, the civil courts. He has spoken publicly. Now, he has alienated a lot of people. A lot of his priests don't like him because they feel he's ignored them, perhaps, I don't know. He absolutely immediately accepted the findings of the inquiry into the Dublin Archdiocese, which was one of the reports that really focused on the actions of previous bishops, archbishops, senior men in the diocese, and their collusion with the civil authorities. The Irish police force absolutely colluded in handing back allegations to the diocese to deal with, and so on. It's a culture of openness in that diocese that makes it really, I think, a model of how people should operate across the Catholic world. That's a very interesting question, and research varies across the world. With the offenders we work with, about 30% have been sexually abused themselves. But what we found is that every one of them have had some fairly serious adverse childhood experience, be it maybe physical, emotional abuse, the death of a parent, poverty. But the main theme running through all the offenders is their inability to form an intimate adult relationship. Now, lots of the guys who come to us are married, have children, but their focus will be on I suppose they feel powerful in relation to the children they abuse, as opposed to engaging with a real life woman or man or whatever their preference is. That seems to be the common theme across all the offenders. And of course, it's always a difficulty, because when we start talking about this being a cause of sex offending, that leaves a lot of survivors feeling, oh, now everybody's going to be looking at me thinking I'm a potential sex offender. Whereas we do know that 99.9% of people who've been sexually abused will never go on to sex offend, and that's really important. I think in the most recent census, about 80% of Irish people, and that's only a couple of years ago, identify themselves as Catholic. And most Irish people will probably still get married in a Catholic church, have their child baptized in a Catholic church, communion, confirmation, and so on. But they may never, or rarely attend regular Sunday Mass, for example. And I think they'll have adopted a much more European approach to Catholicism, where they'll make up their own minds. For example, people will use contraception, that goes without saying. People will get divorced, although we have a very low divorce rate in Ireland. We've only had divorce since the middle of the 90s, but it's way down on, for example, America or indeed the UK. But on the other hand, people voted overwhelmingly for gay marriage, absolutely overwhelmingly. And just about every person in Ireland has now been to a gay marriage. Even in the most rural areas, people are absolutely embracing that. What really surprised me, actually, was the vote in the abortion referendum, which was, a very bitter, I suppose, public discourse. But again, about 66% of people voted in favour of abortion, partly because typically it was an Irish answer to an Irish problem. Something like 5 women a day were going to the UK to have an abortion. So we did have abortion, except causing immense suffering. So people, I think, rationalised it that way. So Ireland is not the Catholic country it was, in the sense the Catholic Church does not at all have the same power or authority. People make up their own minds. And I'm not sure what your second question, does that answer that as well? Yeah. I think sexual repression in Ireland are things of the past, absolutely. People routinely live together before they're married, whatever. I think, though, some of the core Catholic values would still be very much part of Irish life, a sense of, I think most people would probably still believe in a deity. I think most people would still believe in Christian values, love with thy neighbour, and so on. It's still a good place to live in terms of community, in terms of being honourable in relationships, honourable in our dealings, and so on. I think it's imbued. And of course, the other thing is the Catholic Church still controls education. About 90% of primary schools, Margaret might correct me if I'm wrong, 90% of primary schools are Catholic schools owned and run by the Catholic Church. And that has been a huge debate recently too, the disinvestment of Catholic authority in some of those schools. So children are still being raised with Catholic ethos, but what they're meeting at school, perhaps they're meeting at home, maybe two very different things. That's an impossible question to answer, but I do wonder with a lot of the young men who come into us, because they're now in healthy-ish sexual relationships with their girlfriends, they're having babies, or they're in a gay relationship or something like that with one of their peers. But in the meantime, when they were 17, 18, 14, 15, 16, they abused a younger child, so they end up on the Phoenix program. And if they hadn't become sexualized to those images, if they hadn't seen that this is something that could be done, would they actually have abused those children? Would they have gone through the normal torments of adolescent sexuality and ended up in a healthy adult sexual relationship? Undoubtedly, because very few of the sex offenders who attend our program are actually paedophiles. Most of them are actually in other adult sexual relationships as well. For the paedophiles, yes, they probably would have ended up anyway. But I think there's a lot of young men who went down that path who might not have gone down if they hadn't had access to those images and videos at such a young age, But I mean, the answer is I don't know, really. The victims have to be prioritised, undoubtedly. But we have huge responsibility as a community to to work with these offenders, first of all in a treatment program, which is no walk in the park, I can tell you, at all, or if they're convicted and they go to jail. Now, in Ireland and Europe generally, the types of sentences that sex offenders get would be much, much lower than happens in the States. Typically, you're often talking about 2 years, 5 years, 7 years, that sort of sentence. So, and most Irish people, if you asked, would say they should be locked up forever, they should be castrated, they should never be allowed out again. But that's not the reality. You know, we live under, they have constitutional protection. And we have to hold out the hope that with good treatment, there is a redemptive factor there. But communities have to become involved. Like when we ostracize sex offenders, we drive them underground. And that is where they're at their most dangerous. I know you have, I'm not sure what it's called in America, Sarah's Law, is it? Or, you know, where offenders' addresses have to be put up on things. And we have campaigned very strongly in Ireland for that not to be the case, because whenever people in the community know where a sex offender is living, a vigilante group starts, they burn the person out, beat them up, whatever, and where do they go then, and who knows where they are, and how can they be monitored or whatever. There is some very good evidence from the UK and in a small way from Ireland about communities coming together and putting in place circles of support where responsible people in the community with special training will meet with the sex offender every week, will make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, that they're going to their work, that they have a place to live, and that they have some social contact. One of my colleagues is a member of one of those groups, and she does things like just meet the guy for a coffee. He mightn't have spoken to anyone for 2 days. Go and see a film with him. Provide that sort of normal support that will help reintegrate him back into the community, but will also keep him monitored. I mean, they will always have to be monitored. There's no easy option of that. But it's not enough to leave that to the social workers or the police officers or whoever. Communities need to become involved. And that is perhaps a place where church communities could really play a really positive role as part of an outreach to the people who are perhaps seen really as the very dregs of society. Number one, if somebody is convicted in the criminal courts, I would strongly suggest, depending on the gravity of the offence, that they should be on a sex offender register for the rest of their lives, and that resources be provided, be it through probation officers. Do you have them in the States? Probation officers, social workers, police officers, whoever, to regularly monitor or visit them. If people are not convicted, but there are substantial allegations against them, through mandatory reporting, the child protection social workers will have contact with them. They're much harder to manage because if there hasn't a conviction and if they're not acknowledging what has happened. But all the guys coming in our programs have to acknowledge what they've done. And then if they will engage with support services, yeah. But it's a real problematic one. It is, if there is not a conviction. And as I said, probably about 1 in 20 child sex abusers are convicted. Yeah, one of the things that happened in Ireland with all the clerical abuse scandals is that, you know, before that, I think a lot of people who were sexually abused believed they were the only person this had ever happened to. So even though you mightn't have been abused by a Catholic priest, people felt there are thousands of people like me, and that made it easier to come forward. And it's remarkable how many more people are prepared to speak publicly, ordinary people speak publicly about what has happened to them. But it always helps, and there's been a couple of very high-profile Irish musicians, writers and so on who've spoken publicly about their experience, and that facilitates a conversation too. I would have to say, though, Ireland is no heaven on earth in relation to this, and I would think there is a great fatigue in Ireland about sexual abuse, and of course the next big public conversation is about abuse in the family, and we're nowhere near there. That is a tragedy still unfolding. You know, people are fatigued. Yeah, there has been a huge shift in Ireland, but you know we're not there yet, Paige. Not quite there. So.
Thank you so much, Maeve.
Thank you, Tom.